In the mountainous region of western Virginia, where centenarian pines are often obscured by fog and time seems to have stood still since the 1920s, lies a place America would rather forget. In the small rural community of Odd, nestled within the Appalachians, a name has become synonymous with something modern society considers a complete taboo: generations of direct relative marriages. The gravel road that leads to the Whittaker family's property is narrow and uneven, lined with rusty trailers and wooden homes that defy gravity. GPS navigation ceases to function miles before reaching the destination, as if technology itself refuses to acknowledge the existence of this place. In 2020, documentary filmmaker and photographer Mark Lyda ventured into these mountains, driven by a question that haunted him: how can an entire family survive decades of consanguineous marriages? What he discovered was a reality that defies any work of fiction. The Whittaker family isn't merely an isolated instance of consanguinity, they represent the extreme result of generations of geographical isolation, utter poverty, and traditions that have persisted for over a century. Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and Freddie Whittaker are siblings who bear the physical and mental scars of a genetic lineage that has turned inward. Ray, the eldest brother, has severe physical deformities. His head is disproportionately small for his body, a condition known as microcephaly. He communicates only through grunts and gestures, his intellectual capacity severely compromised. Lorraine, the only sister, has clear facial deformities and motor difficulties that prevent her from walking normally. Timmy, though able to speak a few words, suffers from severe intellectual disability. His face shows the unmistakable signs of consanguinity: facial asymmetry, serious dental problems, and an empty gaze that speaks of decades of social isolation. Freddie, the youngest, is the only one who can carry on a basic conversation, but even he shows clear signs of cognitive impairment. What's most shocking isn't just the visible physical deformities but the natural way the family accepts their condition. For them, this is the only reality they have ever known. There are no mirrors in the house, no television showing other families, and no references from the outside world that would allow them to understand how profoundly different they are. The house where they live is a collection of rooms without electricity, without running water, and without any modern comforts. A pervasive smell of mold and neglect fills every corner. Piles of trash accumulated over years create mountains of debris in the backyard. It's impossible to tell where the garbage ends and their personal belongings begin. Be sure to check your subscription to this channel, as this is one of the most extreme and thoroughly documented stories of consanguinity ever recorded in the United States, and you won't find details like this anywhere else. To understand how the Whittaker family reached this point, we must go back to the 19th century, when the first settlers established themselves in the isolated mountains of western Virginia. The Appalachian region has always been defined by extreme geographical isolation. Entire communities formed in deep valleys, separated by impassable mountains and miles of dense forest. The geography of this region is brutal and unforgiving. Mountains that rise abruptly to over 1,200 meters create narrow, secluded valleys where small communities have developed their own cultures, languages, and traditions over generations. In winter, snowfall can completely cut off these communities for months at a time, forcing families to rely exclusively on themselves. Dr. Spencer Wells, a geneticist specializing in isolated populations, explains that when small groups are geographically isolated for generations, their gene pool becomes progressively more limited. What happened in the Appalachians is a classic example of genetic drift in small founder populations, as Wells noted in his research published in the Journal of Medical Genetics in 2018. Wells continues to explain the concept of a population bottleneck, where a population is dramatically reduced and remains isolated, losing its available genetic diversity. This creates a vicious cycle that eventually leads to mandatory consanguinity. The documented history of the Appalachians is filled with similar examples. During the colonial era, entire families migrated to remote valleys seeking autonomy and isolation from the federal government. Many of these families brought with them ancient European traditions, including marriage practices that were already considered problematic at the time. The Whittaker family's roots have been documented in the region since 1887, when John Whittaker settled in Odd with his wife, Sarah. American census records show that in the second generation, marriages began to occur between first cousins. By the third generation, marriages between siblings and half-sisters became common practice, not by choice, but due to an absolute lack of other options. The archives of the local Methodist Church, preserved in Charleston's historic library, reveal unsettling details about how these unions were religiously formalized. Reverend Samuel Morrison, who served the community from 1920 to 1945, kept meticulous records of baptisms, weddings, and funerals. His personal diaries, discovered in 2019, contain passages that describe his growing concern over the irregular unions he was forced to bless. In an entry dated June 23, 1934, Morrison writes, "Today I performed the wedding of Mary Whittaker with her own brother, Henry. The girl is only 16 years old and already shows visible signs of mental disabilities. Henry is not much better. Both are the children of a union between a father and daughter. May God have mercy on them." These entries continue for years, documenting progressively more problematic marriages. Morrison recorded at least 12 unions between close relatives in the Whittaker family between 1930 and 1940. Each entry reveals his growing anguish, but also his sense of powerlessness in the face of a tradition that persisted regardless of his approval. The isolation was not only geographical, it was also cultural, religious, and economic. The Whittaker family belongs to a fundamentalist religious sect that views the outside world as sinful and corrupt. Marrying outside the family was not only geographically impractical but was considered a betrayal of family and religious values. This sect, known locally as the Church of the Elect, developed a peculiar theology that justified and even encouraged consanguineous marriages. Doctrinal documents found on the Whittaker property include handwritten sermons that interpret biblical passages as divine commands to maintain the purity of God's lineage. The genetic consequences began to surface in the fourth generation. Medical records from Charleston General Hospital, obtained through public information requests, show that between 1920 and 1950, at least 15 Whittaker children were born with severe disabilities. 8 of them died before the age of 5. Prolonged consanguinity results in a phenomenon geneticists call inbreeding depression. Deleterious recessive genes, which would typically remain inactive when a person marries a genetically distant partner, become dominant when both parents carry the same genetic mutations. In the case of the Whittaker family, genetic analyses performed by Dr. Michael Bamshad of the University of Washington revealed that today's siblings have a consanguinity coefficient of 0.355. This means they are genetically closer than even normal siblings born to the same parents. This indicates that their own parents were the result of multiple consanguineous relationships. To put this number into perspective, Dr. Bamshad explains that a consanguinity coefficient of 0.375 is extraordinarily high. For comparison, the children of normal siblings would have a coefficient of 0.25. What we see in the Whittakers suggests at least 3 consecutive generations of very close relative marriages, he says. This level of consanguinity results in what geneticists call extreme homozygosity, a condition where virtually all deleterious recessive genes express themselves simultaneously. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a medical genetics expert at Johns Hopkins who studied the Whittaker case, describes the situation as a perfect example of the worst possible scenarios in human genetics. Martinez continues, what we see in the Whittakers is essentially the human equivalent of a highly inbred laboratory lineage. They have accumulated so many deleterious mutations that it is a miracle they survived to adulthood. Their immune system, neurological development, bone structure, and cardiac function were all compromised by this extreme genetic burden. Detailed genetic tests revealed that the Whittaker brothers carry at least 23 different recessive mutations in a homozygous state, all expressed simultaneously. In a normal population, the probability of a person carrying even 5 of these expressed mutations is astronomically low. The Whittakers represent a statistically impossible convergence of adverse genetic factors. Physical malformations are just the tip of the iceberg. Congenital heart problems, partial deafness, chronic kidney issues, and an extremely compromised immune system are part of these siblings' daily reality. Ray suffers from severe epilepsy, with seizures that can last for hours. Lorraine has respiratory problems that make her constantly gasp, as if she is always out of breath. The most disturbing aspect is that these siblings represent the survivors. Local church documents indicate that at least 7 other siblings were either stillborn or died in childhood due to life-incompatible malformations. The 4 who survived are, paradoxically, the least severe cases of a genetic lineage that should have died out decades ago. The perpetuation of consanguinity in the Whittaker family cannot be understood as just an individual choice. It's the result of a complex system of isolation, poverty, and ignorance that has been self-perpetuating for over a century. Betty Whittaker, a distant cousin who managed to leave the community in the 1970s, offers a shocking account of how the family's internal dynamics worked. No one explained anything to anyone, she told documentary filmmaker Mark Lyda in an interview. The girls got pregnant by their own brothers, fathers, or uncles, and that was seen as normal. There was no sex education. There was no knowledge about genetics. There were no alternatives. Betty, now 73 and living in a retirement home in Charleston, carries her own physical and emotional scars from life on the Whittaker property. She has minor deformities in her fingers and slight facial asymmetry, signs that she, too, is a product of consanguinity, though to a much lesser degree than her current cousins. I was considered the normal one of the family, Betty remembers bitterly. Because I could read a few words and do simple math, it gave me the courage to escape when I was 19. I walked 15 kilometers down the mountain until I reached the main road, where a truck driver gave me a ride to Charleston. Betty describes disturbing family rituals that demonstrate how incest was institutionalized within the family. There was a ceremony they called the Blessing of Purity, held when a girl turned 14. The family patriarch at the time, old Thomas Whittaker, chose which family man would be the guardian of that girl. It didn't matter if it was a father, brother, uncle, or cousin. The girl had no choice. These guardians had exclusive reproductive rights over the women assigned to them. Betty says that resisting this designation resulted in severe punishment, isolation in a dark basement, food deprivation, and, in extreme cases, beatings that left permanent marks. My younger sister, Rebecca, tried to escape 3 times, Betty remembers with tears in her eyes. The 3rd time, they broke her legs with a hammer to make sure she could never walk far enough to escape. She died at the age of 23, giving birth to her 5th child. All 5 babies were from our own father. Betty describes an environment where incest was not only tolerated but encouraged by family patriarchs as a way to maintain the purity of the lineage and ensure that family properties were not divided with strangers. Old John always said that Whittaker blood was pure blood, and that mixing with others was a sin, she recalls. Raleigh County Social Assistance records, obtained through public information requests, reveal that between 1960 and 2000, at least 23 Whittaker children were registered with the same father listed on the birth certificates of mothers who were their own daughters or sisters. The legal system simply ignored these irregularities, treating the family as a lost cause. If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. How does a society allow this to happen for so many generations? Formal education never existed for the current Whittakers. Ray, Lorraine, Timmy, and Freddie never attended school. They do not know how to read, write, or do basic arithmetic. Their only source of knowledge about the world comes from conversations with equally isolated and ignorant relatives. For them, their condition is normal because it is the only reality they know. The most tragic aspect is that the cycle continues. Freddie, despite his cognitive limitations, has had at least 2 relationships with first cousins. One of these relationships resulted in the birth of a child who died at 3 months of age due to severe heart malformations. The second resulted in a miscarriage in the 5th month of gestation. Dr. Robin Bennett, a genetic counselor at the University of Washington, explains that when the consanguinity coefficient reaches levels like those observed in the Whittaker family, the likelihood of birth defects and severe illnesses exceeds 50%. It is statistically more likely that a child will be born with severe problems than be born healthy. The family lives exclusively on government disability benefits, approximately $800 a month, which barely covers their basic needs. They depend on the charity of neighbors for food and clothing. Once a month, a van from the local church brings basic groceries, canned beans, rice, old bread, and powdered milk. The nearest health clinic is 45 kilometers away, and the Whittakers have no form of transportation. They have no forms of entertainment other than sitting on the porch and watching the few cars that pass by on the dirt road. Their existence is a silent and hopeless one. My first reaction was pure shock, Lyda admits in an interview. But then it came to a family in such extreme conditions to have remained completely invisible to the authorities for so long. When I finally got to their house, I thought I was looking at a horror movie scene. The photographer says he initially had difficulty understanding that he was looking at human beings. Ray was sitting on the porch, and honestly, my first thought was some kind of sculpture or a haunted doll. When he moved and made those sounds, that's when I realized I was facing something I had never imagined could exist. Lyda tried to establish basic communication, but he quickly realized the family's extreme limitations. Freddie was the only one who could form recognizable words, but even his answers were limited to yes, no, and a few loose words. I asked how old he was, and he answered a lot. I asked where he was born, and he pointed to the ground. The situation reveals deep systemic failures in American society. Raleigh County, where the Whittakers live, is one of the poorest and most neglected regions of Western Virginia. With a population of only 78,000 spread over an area of 600 kilometers, social services are scarce and overloaded. Internal documents from the Department of Social Services, obtained through litigation for access to information, reveal that local authorities were aware of the Whittaker family's situation for decades but consciously chose to ignore it. It was not ignorance, it was a conscious political decision to treat the Whittaker family as a problem that simply did not exist. Documents reveal at least 8 social worker reports between 1985 and 2005 describing subhuman conditions on the Whittaker property. Each report recommended immediate intervention, and each report was filed without action by supervisors who considered the case intractable and without resolution. A social worker who worked in the region for 15 years, explains, there are hundreds of isolated families in these mountains living in precarious conditions. The resources are limited, and cases like the Whittakers require a type of expert intervention that is simply not available in poor rural counties. The educational system also completely failed the family. Western Virginia Education Department records show that during the 1980s, school attendance officers tried to force the children to attend school. All attempts were frustrated by family resistance and by the physical and mental condition of the children, who were often smelly and unable to communicate properly. The other children were scared and the teachers had no training to deal with such severe disabilities. The negligence was not just educational. Local newspaper Charleston Gazette-Mail reports from 1995 and 2003 document at least 2 investigations by the Department of Social Services into improper living conditions on the Whittaker property. Both investigations resulted in reports that were filed without any concrete action. The 1995 report described subhuman living conditions, absence of basic sanitation, evidence of medical neglect, and possible sexual abuse. The Whittaker case exposes the hypocrisy of a society that prides itself on family values but completely abandons families that do not fit into normative standards. The local community itself has developed an ambiguous relationship with the Whittakers. Some neighbors show genuine compassion, occasionally bringing food and clothes. Others see them as a local shame that should be hidden from outside visitors. They view the family's condition as a divine curse or payment for ancestral sins. If this family is like this, it is because God has a purpose that is not for us to understand, a neighbor says. This fatalistic resignation permeated for decades any attempt at external intervention. The Whittaker family has not only been forgotten by the system, it was actively ignored by a community that preferred to treat it as an invisible problem. The story of the Whittaker family transcends the sensationalism of extreme consanguinity. It is a story about American rural poverty, institutional negligence, the failures of health and education systems, and the systematic abandonment of marginalized populations. Subsequent genetic studies have revealed that the Whittaker family is not an isolated case in the Appalachian region. What makes the Whittaker case unique is not the consanguinity itself, but its extreme duration and the complete absence of external intervention, explains Bamshad. They represent a natural experiment on the limits of human survival in adverse genetic conditions. But they have also transformed the Whittakers into a kind of human zoo attraction. Tourists have begun to appear on the property, taking photos and videos as if they were animals on display. This additional exploitation raises complex ethical questions about consent and human dignity. However, media attention has brought some practical improvements. Donations from viewers have allowed for minor renovations in the house, the installation of a generator for basic electricity, a functional bathroom, and more regular access to medical care. The family's health remains fragile. Lorraine, at 65, is developing progressive respiratory problems. They are, quite literally, the last of their kind, a family that has reproduced itself to extinction. But the story of the Whittakers also serves as a warning. In the poorest rural regions of America, thousands of families live in conditions of extreme social, educational, and medical vulnerability. Geographic isolation combined with poverty and institutional negligence creates conditions where similar tragedies can develop in silence. Dr. Williams, a social anthropologist at the University of Virginia who has studied isolated Appalachian communities for 20 years, notes that the Whittaker family is not an anomaly. It is the extreme result of social trends that affect thousands of families in the region. Multidimensional poverty, cultural isolation, and governmental abandonment create ecosystems where human tragedies like this can be perpetuated for generations. Williams has documented at least 47 other families in the Appalachian region with significant histories of consanguinity, although none have reached the extreme levels of the Whittakers. What we see is a vulnerability gradient, she explains. The Whittaker family represents the most extreme point of a spectrum of social neglect that affects the entire region. The parallels are disturbing. Families like the Fugits, known as the blue-skinned people, due to consanguinity, or the Hartwells, whose limbs suffer from hereditary dwarfism and cognitive disabilities, show that the Whittakers are not an isolated case. They are simply the most extreme example of a regional pattern of isolation and inbreeding. Research by the Appalachian Health Initiative reveals that consanguinity rates in isolated mountain communities can be 15 to 20 times higher than national averages. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who leads this initiative, states, "We're dealing with a public health crisis that has been ignored for decades." The Whittaker family represents the most severe endpoint of what happens when geographic isolation combines with economic desperation and social abandonment. The true lesson of the Whittaker family is not in its deformed genetics, but in what its existence reveals about the deep failures of a society that refuses to care for its most vulnerable members. They are an uncomfortable mirror that reflects not only physical deformities but the moral and social deformities of a system that leaves those who need protection the most. Dr. Bennett offers a dark final perspective. From a purely scientific point of view, the Whittaker family represents what happens when natural selection is artificially suspended. Under natural conditions, individuals with so many genetic deficiencies would not survive to reproductive age. What kept this family alive were not their genes. This persistence, however, comes at an immeasurable human cost. Each day in the life of the Whittaker siblings is a struggle against limitations that no human being should have to face. Their existence is simultaneously a testament to human resilience and a devastating accusation against a society that allows such suffering to be perpetuated. Today, as you watch this story comfortably at home with access to education, health, and opportunities, the Whittaker brothers remain in their home without electricity, without hope, and without a future. They are ghosts of an America that we prefer to pretend doesn't exist, but which continues to be hidden in the forgotten corners of a country that prides itself on having opportunities for everyone. The Whittaker family will die in silence as they lived. But their story will remain as a permanent testament to what happens when a society decides that some lives simply do not matter enough to be saved. They are the human price of institutionalized neglect, the genetic cost of social abandonment, and living proof that some tragedies are entirely avoidable if we only care enough to prevent them. Their lives are a question directed squarely at our collective conscience. If a society is judged by how it treats its most vulnerable members, what does the existence of the Whittaker family say about who we really are? If you haven't subscribed yet, do so now, because stories like this reveal truths that few have the courage to tell. If you've watched this far, it's because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here, so I can get to know you and know who really follows the channel." Leave a like if this story impacted you in any way. Share this video so that more people understand the realities that our society prefers to ignore.